Nashville, Tennessee. A hot summer night in 1977. The air thick with humidity, and the smell of cigarette smoke mixed with whiskey and beer that seemed to permanently inhabit the backstage corridors of the Ryman Auditorium. In those narrow hallways where country music legends had walked for decades, two worlds were about to collide in a way that nobody could have anticipated. On one side stood Johnny Cash, the living legend of country music, the man in black himself, 55 years old with silver hair slicked back and a weathered face that showed every year of hard living. On the other side stood Lemmy Kilmister, the newly born bad boy of heavy metal, 32 years old but looking older, with long, greasy hair falling past his shoulders, a black leather vest covered in metal studs, chains draped across his chest like ammunition belts, and a bottle of Jack Daniels dangling from his left hand as casually as if it were an extension of his arm. Both were scheduled to perform at the same festival that night, a rare crossover event that brought together country traditionalists and the emerging heavy metal underground. But nobody in that building, not the stage managers, not the roadies, not even the promoters who had booked this unlikely pairing, could have predicted that the backstage encounter would change both of their lives forever. When Johnny Cash rounded the corner and saw Lemmy's costume covered in leather, chains, and metal accessories that seemed designed to offend every sensibility that country music held dear, his face turned to stone. The expression that crossed his features was not anger exactly, but something deeper. Something that looked like a father watching his son walk down a path that could only lead to destruction. The words that came out of his mouth created a shock effect that rippled through the backstage area, silencing conversations and causing heads to turn. "You're going to hell, son." The statement hung in the air like smoke, heavy and accusatory, filled with the weight of conviction and the sadness of certainty. But what happened next? What Lemmy Kilmister said in response to Johnny Cash's condemnation brought tears streaming down the face of June Carter Cash, Johnny's wife, and the woman who had saved him from his own demons. The story that began between these two men in that moment created one of the deepest, most unexpected, and most profound connections between rock and country music that would last for 40 years. And everyone who was in Nashville that night witnessed the birth of one of music history's most unexpected friendships. Johnny Cash was known throughout America as the nation's conscience, a man who had walked through the darkest valleys of addiction and despair only to emerge transformed by faith and love. He cried openly with prisoners at jail concerts in Folsom and San Quentin, sang about the downtrodden and the forgotten, and consoled millions with gospel songs that spoke of redemption and grace. His voice carried the weight of lived experience. Lemmy Kilmister had emerged from England's underground culture, a speed addict who made no apologies for his lifestyle, an atheist who wore his disbelief like armor, and a heavy metal pioneer who played his bass guitar like a weapon of war. The gap between the two men was vast. One sang about walking the line and finding salvation. The other sang about being killed by death and embracing darkness. One had found God in his darkest hour. The other had decided God was a fiction. One wore black as solidarity with the suffering. The other wore black as rebellion. But on that hot night in 1977, fate brought them face to face in the narrow backstage corridors of the Ryman Auditorium, and what happened created one of the most surprising and profound moments in American music history. Johnny Cash was praying quietly before going on stage, as he always did, his hands clasped together, eyes closed, lips moving silently as he communed with the God who he believed had saved his life. The door to his dressing room was slightly open, and June Carter stood beside him, her hand on his shoulder, Her own eyes closed in silent prayer. The noise from the corridor indicated that the heavy metal band was making final preparations, the sound of amplifiers being tested, drums being tightened, guitars tuned to an intentionally discordant pitch. Motorhead had just released their first album, a brutal assault of sound that seemed designed to offend anyone over 30. They were gaining recognition not through mainstream radio, which refused to touch their music, but through the underground network of metal fans hungry for something louder, faster, more dangerous than anything before. Johnny Cash was nearing 50, a legend whose face was recognized coast to coast, whose songs had topped the charts for nearly 2 decades. But he was going through one of the most difficult periods of his career. The country radio stations were not playing his songs as much, program directors saying his sound was too old-fashioned. The younger generation was turning to different sounds, and Johnny felt he had to prove himself all over again to an audience that seemed to have forgotten everything he had accomplished. It was in this tense moment that he encountered Lemmy Kilmister in the corridor. Lemmy was dressed in his iconic uniform of rebellion, a black leather vest worn soft from years of wear, bullet belts crossed over his chest, the brass casings catching the dim backstage light, chains draped around his neck and hanging from his belt loops, metal accessories studding every surface. He had a bottle of Jack Daniels in his hand, gripped loosely by the neck, and was smoking a cigarette, the smoke drifting up past his face in a blue-gray haze. His hair hung past his shoulders in tangles, and the dark circles under his eyes showed clearly he had not slept for days, living on nothing but speed and whiskey and the adrenaline of performance. When Johnny Cash saw him, he hesitated, his whole body tensing. Lemmy noticed Johnny and nodded in greeting, a casual dip of his head. But the expression on Johnny's face was not friendly. At that moment, in Johnny Cash's mind, Lemmy was not just a musician. He was a representative of the devil's work, someone who led youth astray with music that celebrated darkness instead of light, someone who embodied everything Johnny had fought to escape from in his own life. Johnny took a step forward, closing the distance until they were standing almost chest to chest in that narrow corridor, and looked directly into Lemmy's bloodshot eyes, saying in a voice that was quiet but absolutely firm, "You're going to hell, son. You and everything you stand for." His tone was not harsh and definitive like a preacher condemning a sinner from the pulpit. Instead, it was sad and worried, filled with genuine concern, as if carrying the disappointment of a father watching a young man throw his life away, who saw a soul in danger and felt compelled to offer a warning, even if that warning would not be welcomed. Everyone backstage froze. June Carter touched Johnny's arm, trying to calm him down. The other members of Motorhead waited tensely. Lemmy slowly put down his Jack Daniels bottle, extinguished his cigarette, and looked into Johnny Cash's eyes. Everyone expected Lemmy to give an aggressive response, to curse, or to show typical heavy metal anger. But what came out of Lemmy's mouth nailed Johnny Cash to the spot and filled June Carter's eyes with tears. Lemmy said this to Johnny Cash, "Mr. Cash, I am already in hell. Every morning I look at that man in the mirror, and I see where he has taken me. But here is what you know. Hell is not a place, it is a condition. And I chose to be there because, at least it is honest. You preach about heaven, but I know what is in your past. You were there too, were you not? Maybe you still are. The difference is this: I am not hiding it." When Johnny Cash heard these words, the stern expression on his face slowly melted away. Lemmy's words had touched Johnny's deepest wound, because Johnny Cash was also a man who had experienced drug addiction, adultery, violence, and dark days in his past. In the mid-1960s, he had almost ended his career due to amphetamine addiction. He had lost his family and found himself in jails and motel rooms. June Carter had saved him, given him a new life, and since then, Johnny had devoted himself to God and become a musician who called people to goodness. But Lemmy's words reminded Johnny, "The past never truly dies. It is only buried." June Carter touched Johnny's shoulder and turned to Lemmy, asking, "What did you just say?" Lemmy repeated, "I was honest. I am not hiding anything. That is why people can trust me. I am not lying to them so that I can later regret it and beg for forgiveness. I am what I am." Tears streamed from June Carter's eyes because Lemmy's words touched the hypocrisy accusation that Johnny had carried for years. Lemmy was not accusing Johnny. He was offering a different life philosophy. Sin. Do but be honest. Do not hide. Do not take refuge in lies. Johnny Cash took another step toward Lemmy and extended his hand. "You got guts, son. I will give you that." Lemmy shook Johnny's hand, and that handshake became the beginning of one of music history's most surprising friendships. The two men spoke for only a few minutes backstage that night, but those few minutes added a different perspective to both of their lives. Johnny Cash's harsh reaction to Lemmy was actually a reflection of avoiding confronting his own past. In the late 1950s, Johnny Cash was the rising star of country music. "I Walk the Line" and Folsom Prison Blues had turned him into a legend, but the pressure of success, tour exhaustion, and personal problems had driven Johnny to amphetamines. In the early 1960s, a Johnny Cash was swallowing hundreds of pills a day, going on stage without sleeping for days, and his life was out of control. He divorced his first wife, Vivian Liberto, struggled to care for his children, and lost almost all his money. When he married June Carter in 1967, June reconnected him to life, and Johnny struggled to quit drugs. But Johnny Cash could never completely forget his past. The songs he sang at prison concerts, the messages of hope he gave to inmates, were actually him speaking to his own past, his own prison. Johnny had not been in prison, but he had been detained, arrested for drug possession, and had felt himself in a cell. That is why Lemmy's words, "You were there too, were you not?" resonated in Johnny's soul. Yes, Johnny had been there too. Maybe he still was. But Lemmy's honesty reminded Johnny of the hypocrisy in his own life. Johnny was preaching God and salvation while still struggling with the devil inside him. That night backstage, Johnny Cash turned to June Carter and said, "He is right. I was there. Maybe I still am." June squeezed Johnny's hand and replied, "But you chose to come back. He chose to stay." Johnny nodded, but inside him was a doubt. Had he really come back? Or had he just put on a better mask? Lemmy Kilmister's life philosophy was simple but radical. Be yourself and never apologize. Lemmy was born in 1945 in Stoke-on-Trent, England. His mother was a working woman, his father was unknown, and Lemmy grew up in poverty. In the late 1960s, he worked as Jimi Hendrix's roadie and was introduced to drugs like LSD and speed. In 1972, he joined the space rock band Hawkwind and played bass guitar, making the group's sound heavier and more aggressive. But in 1975, he was arrested at the Canadian border for possession of speed, Hawkwind fired him, and Lemmy fell to the darkest point of his career. At that dark point, Lemmy made a decision. He would no longer lie to anyone. He would not change himself to please anyone. When he founded Motorhead, the group's slogan became, "Everything louder than everyone else." This was not just about music. It was a life manifesto. Lemmy did not hide that he used speed, openly said he was an atheist, admitted he collected Nazi memorabilia, but specified he did not support fascism, only had interest in its aesthetics, confessed to being with thousands of women, and never thought about conforming to society's expectations. And this honesty made him both beloved and hated, but Lemmy did not care. He had chosen to be in hell because, at least there, he was free. In his encounter with Johnny Cash, Lemmy defended exactly this philosophy. When he told Johnny, "You were there too," he was not accusing him. He was simply saying, "We are both in the same place, but you are trying to hide it, while I am living it openly." And this honesty made June Carter cry, because June knew how much Johnny struggled with his past, how he blamed himself. Lemmy's freedom reminded June of the chains Johnny still carried. After the stage performances that night, Johnny Cash and Lemmy Kilmister met again backstage. This time, the atmosphere was different. Johnny invited Lemmy to his dressing room, and June Carter was also there. The three people talked for several hours. Johnny told Lemmy about his own past: amphetamine addiction, divorce, prison concerts, and reconnecting with God. Lemmy shared his story: being fired from Hawkwind, founding Motorhead, speed and alcohol addiction, atheism, and rebellion against societal norms. The two men, although they seemed completely opposite, discovered they actually had many commonalities. Both were struggling with addiction. Johnny was trying to overcome his addiction by taking refuge in God. Lemmy accepted his addiction and chose to live with it. Both felt the pressure of the music industry. Johnny was suffering because country radios now found him too old. Lemmy was still trying to prove himself in the heavy metal world. Both struggled with conforming to society's expectations. And most importantly, both saw music as a means of salvation. For Johnny, music was spreading God's message. For Lemmy, music was the purest expression of freedom. June Carter played the mediator role. She said to Lemmy, "You say you are honest, but honesty without compassion is cruelty." Lemmy replied, "Maybe. But I would rather be cruel and honest than kind and fake." Johnny laughed and said, "You know what, Lemmy? You remind me of myself when I was younger. Angry, defiant, and terrified." Lemmy looked at Johnny and said, "I am not terrified. I am free." Johnny shook his head and said, "No, son, you are terrified. That is why you drink. That is why you take speed. You are running from something, just like I was." This statement shook Lemmy, because Johnny Cash was right. Lemmy seemed free, but actually he was constantly running. From loneliness, from the fear of failure, from the fear of rejection. Jack Daniels and speed were not just creativity tools, they were also methods of numbing the pain. Lemmy confronted Johnny Cash's words that night, and perhaps for the first time in his life, he asked himself, "Am I truly free?" Johnny Cash and Lemmy Kilmister talked about God that night. Johnny believed that God had saved him. Lemmy believed that God did not exist, but the discussion was not hostile. Johnny asked Lemmy, "If there is no God, then where does your music come from?" Lemmy replied, "From anger, pain, and the desire to scream at the world." Johnny smiled and said, "That sounds like prayer to me." Lemmy looked surprised and said, "Prayer? I do not pray." Johnny said, "You do. You just do not call it that. Every time you sing, you are praying. You are crying out to something bigger than yourself, even if you do not believe it is there." Lemmy had never thought about this perspective. Music was his means of escaping from God, but according to Johnny, music was the moment when he was closest to God. The two men debated this paradox for hours. June Carter said, "Maybe Lemmy's God is music itself." Johnny thought about this and said, "Maybe you are right. Maybe we all worship something. For me, it is Jesus. For him, it is freedom." That night, Johnny Cash and Lemmy Kilmister accepted each other's differences, but they also discovered their commonalities. Both were people who had been pushed outside of society, judged and labeled. Both used music to survive. And both were fighting their own demons, just with different methods. After that backstage encounter in 1977, Johnny Cash and Lemmy Kilmister met several more times. In the mid-1980s, they met again at a music awards ceremony. Johnny approached Lemmy and asked, "Still in hell, son?" Lemmy laughed and replied, "Would not be anywhere else." Johnny nodded and said, "I respect that. At least you are consistent." Johnny said to Lemmy, "You know, you were right that night in Nashville. I was there too. Maybe I still am." Lemmy touched Johnny's shoulder and said, "The difference is, you are trying to get out. I am making it home." In the 1990s, Johnny Cash experienced a renaissance in his career. Working with producer Rick Rubin on the American Recordings series, he reached a new generation. Lemmy had also entered heavy metal history with Motorhead. His songs like Ace of Spades had become the anthem of metal fans for generations. The two men, although they went on different paths, had left lasting marks in music history. When Johnny Cash died in 2003, Lemmy said in an interview, "Johnny Cash taught me that there can be different forms of honesty. He was honest to God. I was honest to myself. Both are valid paths." When Lemmy heard the news of Johnny Cash's death, he was sitting at the Rainbow Bar and Grill. He had his usual Jack Daniels and cola in his hand. The bartender said, "Did you hear? Johnny Cash died." Lemmy bowed his head and said, "Yeah, the man in black finally went home." That night, Lemmy played Johnny Cash songs on the jukebox. Folsom Prison Blues, I Walk the Line, and Hurt played. Lemmy remembered Johnny with each song. The first backstage encounter, the "You're Going to Hell" words, June Carter's tears, the deep conversations that lasted all night. And Lemmy, sitting alone that night, raised a glass for Johnny Cash. "To the man who taught me that even in hell, you can find grace." The story of Johnny Cash and Lemmy Kilmister is often not told in music history because on the surface they seem to have nothing in common. One is country, the other heavy metal. One believed in God, the other was atheist. One sought salvation, the other was comfortable in hell. But that backstage encounter in 1977 taught us this: honesty can come in different forms. Johnny Cash was honest by confronting his past and taking refuge in God. Lemmy Kilmister was honest by never hiding his past and living as he was. And both were right, both were wrong, and both were human. June Carter died just a few months after Johnny in 2003. But in a letter June wrote, she mentioned that Nashville night. "That night when I saw Lemmy, I saw Johnny's past. And what Lemmy said to Johnny helped Johnny reconcile with himself. Sometimes hell exists to test us. Sometimes to remind us who we are." June Carter's words captured the essence of the story. Hell is not a place. It is a condition. And how you live in that condition determines your character. When Lemmy Kilmister died in 2015, Johnny Cash's song Hurt was played at his funeral. This was Lemmy's last request. Because Lemmy had understood the pain, the regret, and the honesty in the last breath in that song. I knew the two men went on different paths, but arrived at the same truth. Music is the most honest expression of the soul. And honesty is sometimes found in hell, sometimes in heaven. What matters is that wherever you are honest with yourself. Today, fans who listen to Johnny Cash and Lemmy Kilmister generally think about how different the two men were. But in that backstage corridor in Nashville in 1977, the moment witnessed by June Carter's tears proved this: Music transcends boundaries. Both the believer and the non-believer feel the same pain, seek the same freedom, and desire the same honesty. Johnny Cash and Lemmy Kilmister taught us this. Hell and heaven may be the same place, just looked at from different perspectives. And both meet in music. And the story that began that night in Nashville resonated in the lives of both men for 40 years. Johnny Cash, before his death, said in an interview, "Lemmy Kilmister taught me that authenticity does not require redemption. It only requires truth." Lemmy, in his last interview in 2015, said, "Johnny Cash showed me that even the saved are still sinners. The difference is, some admit it, some hide it." The two men, although they seemed like opposite poles to each other, were actually two sides of the same coin. Johnny Cash, the traveler from hell to heaven. Lemmy Kilmister, the rebel who made hell his home. And both remained as legends in music history because they were honest. In different ways, but they were honest. And honesty always wins. It is always remembered. It always resonates in music.